Thank you. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening for an exciting book talk by Julia Phillips. Just before I go any further, I want to remind you that all of our programs are made possible by the Friends Annual Campaign and through your generous donations and your continued support so that all of our events are available to everyone in the community. If you'll please silence your cell phones and refrain from texting. Thank you very much. Disappearing Earth is the debut novel from Julia Phillips and is being translated in 13 countries. It is a finalist for the National Book Award, has been also and has been named one of the best books of 2019 by, so far, USA Today, Vanity Fair, Entertainment Weekly, and Book Page named Julia one of the 15 female authors to watch in 2019. Julia has loved Russia since she was a teenager.
That's true.
Is that enough?
That's fair. We could say more, but.
Well, actually, she went to camp and there was a Russian-American counselor, yes. And I think that was the reason. But anyway, so it was not unusual that she studied Russian literature at Barnard. She also studied in Moscow and is fluent in the Russian language. In 2011, Julia spent 2 years on a Fulbright grant living in the remote peninsula of the Russian Far East, Kamchatka. The perfect setting, she said, for disappearing Earth. After a Q&A, you may purchase books from Barrett Bookstore, Darien's own independent bookstore. And if you'll just refrain from returning to the refreshment table until after, we would love to have you go back then. So now please join me in welcoming Julia Phillips to Darien.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I love this. We're going to use lots of technology together tonight. It is so wonderful to be here. Thank you so much for coming out this evening to talk about my debut novel, Disappearing Earth. I put a big thing here, so if anyone's lost, you can grab a refreshment and then leave. Duck out the back door now. But really, to be here with you in this beautiful library it's the dream of my life. It means everything to me, and to be together makes me feel like that dream comes true over and over again. So I'm so grateful to you. Now, I talk about this book like it's my debut novel. I call it my debut, but the truth is that my first novel actually already came out 24 years ago, thanks to a public library just like this one. So, so this is me. Here I am in some very 90s attire. This is 1995. And this is the Montclair Times from Montclair, New Jersey, where I grew up. And it says, Thursday, December 7th, 1995, participants in the Write Your Own Book workshops display their efforts, the results of a recent 4-week program sponsored by the Montclair Public Library's Youth Services Department. So that's me, and that's my first book. I'm holding it in my hand against my enormous white 1990s t-shirt, so you probably can't see it. It was a murder mystery about a dead body inside a snowman. And that plot... Exactly, it was like a whodunit with violence and snow. Okay, actually stayed very similar. And I have to say, I have to now disclose, I don't know if the statute of limitations is up on this, but I plagiarized that plot entirely wholesale from a Christopher Pike book that I just read. But it took me more than 2 decades to publish the next book, but Disappearing Earth really doesn't stray far from this source material. I like to look at this kid picture of myself because growing up I always wanted to be a novelist, and where I spent my childhood in Jersey looked really, really different from the Russian volcanic peninsula where this book ended up being set. As a kid, where I was felt so far away from where I wanted to be, and especially as a teenager, I spent a lot of time feeling stuck. But my town had this library that had programs like this. It held portals, this space to thousands of places. It had Alice Munro's Canada, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Colombia, Louise Erdrich's North Dakota, Toni Morrison's Michigan and Ohio. And those books opened the minds and hearts of me and my friends and all of us, all the kids that went there, to infinite possibilities, and they filled us with hope. So to be here in this space makes me feel that hope all over again. It makes me feel filled up with it because of 3 floors, 2.5 floors packed with possibilities here in Darien. And all of you who, in the midst of your busy lives, your busy weeks, what, a Tuesday evening, am I right? It's Tuesday? You have your own concerns and your needs and your obligations, and you came here to be with other readers and writers. That's a really generous thing to do. Your presence strengthens my faith in community and in connection and in the good that we can offer each other. It makes me feel the opposite of stuck. It makes me feel like we're going someplace together. And that's how I feel when I think about a library, when I think about the space that we're in, which dedicates itself to presenting all of these books, holding these events, offering these refreshments, unbelievable, and giving every day to anyone who enters 1,000 new ways to see the world. It's really not easy work to do, but libraries do it. They teach little kids to dream big. They encourage us all to tell our wildest snowman murder mysteries, even if they're plagiarized. I don't think the librarians knew mine was plagiarized, but they were very encouraging. So I hope we'll keep coming here and borrowing books and donating in support of a place that means so much to so many. And I hope that we'll spend tonight sustaining our hope in each other and celebrating everything that stories can do. This evening I want to talk with you about one particular story, how one book, my novel, my debut novel, came to be. I'm going to show you some pictures, which is why I have the slideshow, and read just a couple pages, about 5 minutes from Disappearing Earth, and then we'll have a conversation together. And I'm crossing my fingers that you'll have some questions to ask me, because writing can be a very lonely process, but obviously this here now is anything but. We're here together to have a dialogue. And I'm really excited to hear your thoughts. I've been waiting a very long time to hear them because I started working on Disappearing Earth a decade ago. So growing up, I dreamed of writing books, but I also had this interest in Russia, sparked by this mysterious camp counselor. In high school, the way some of my friends got into music and they would go to concerts and shows on the weekends, I got really into learning Cyrillic, and I tried to convince our 10th grade Ukrainian chemistry teacher to lead a language club, which then sort of devolved into like an eating Slavic candy club. We would just, she would bring us worksheets and try to teach us, and we would just eat all these little Ukrainian chocolates. In college, I majored in English so I could fill my days with creative writing classes, and I minored in Russian so I could spend a semester in Moscow. And in 2009, I thought, okay, the best way to combine these pursuits is going to be to set a novel written in English in Russia. So then I can move to the country and research the project and scratch all my intellectual itches at once. So I wanted to move to Russia. And for years, I had heard the word Kamchatka as a figure of speech, because if you are in the last row of Russian class, the professor will say, you know, what are you doing out there in Kamchatka? Or like, I can't hear you all the way from Kamchatka. You're in Kamchatka right now. You're far, far away. So how far are we talking exactly? Okay, so here's Russia. It's very big. It's hard to imagine how big. Moscow there is that sort of, I would say like center where all those arteries go into. There's Moscow. That's the capital city of the entire country. And north of it, right underneath Finland, is St. Petersburg, right? So those are about 425 miles apart. That's about the distance from Washington, D.C. to Boston. It's like a big, big day trip, you might say. And here's Kamchatka, over here. So that's that peninsula is Kamchatka. The distance from Moscow to the Kamchatka Peninsula is about 4,200 miles. So that's about the distance from DC to Berlin. Russia's very big. And I like to show the map because I think it's hard for us to fathom it, even hard sometimes for Russians to fathom how enormous the country is. It's almost a fifth of the populated land on Earth. It's a huge country across its 2 continents. And Kamchatka is a peninsula, as you can see. It's the size of California. So that's how much land we're talking here. And it juts out into the Bering Strait. So right here's Alaska here, swinging out. And these are the Aleutian Islands. And then it goes into these islands called the Commander Islands, which are part of Russia and part of Kamchatka. So no roads connect Kamchatka to the Russian mainland. And when you look at the size of the country, you can say, oh, I see why. It's an enormous amount of infrastructure to build. And it's on the Pacific Rim of Fire. So the ground is sort of shaky and unstable, and things like roads or train tracks require a lot of maintenance. So because of that, Kamchatka is pretty isolated. It's only accessible by air or by sea. And until 1991, it wouldn't have been accessible to us at all. It was a Soviet military base where no foreigners were permitted. So it was actually the base of the Pacific Naval Fleet for the Soviet Union. You can see why. It's very protected. It's next to all these different countries. These days, Kamchatka is no longer closed. It's, in fact, very, very open, and it's a hotspot for adventure tourism. It's filled with volcanoes and geysers and seismic activity. People go heli-skiing there. People go hunting there. It's a complicated and fascinating place. It's much more than the farthest seat in a room. It's the spectacular edge of the world. So I learned about Kamchatka. My plan was set. I want to write a book on Kamchatka. I spent 2 years applying for funding to go there, and in 2011, I got really lucky, and a fellowship came through. Finally getting to see this peninsula in person, this part of the world, stunned me. My first day there, I went to the main city center, which is a plaza. It has a shipyard on your right, so imagine sort of a beach. There's this shipyard, there's a big hill on your left, and there's this bay open out in front of you. Behind you is a square, a pedestrian square, where people walk back and forth. There's a big statue of Lenin that people that live there called Batman because he has a big coat that sweeps out behind him. It looks like a cape. Way out on the opposite shore of this bay are the tiny lights of a nuclear submarine facility. It's actually still a closed city on Kamchatka, and it's still the biggest nuclear submarine base in Russia. Above that city are these mountains that are so huge and distant that they look flat. They look like rows of cut paper, like dark blue, light blue, white. I had never been in a place like that before. I don't know if you can see me. I'm very happy in this picture. I'm just like so excited. You know, I grew up in Jersey, right? And visiting New York City, I would go to Times Square, and even the lights would just blow my mind. It was so beautiful and so exciting. The landscape of a volcanic peninsula was impossible to fathom. So again, I was lucky. People at the university, at the public library, in outdoor clubs, they started offering to show me around. And meeting that many strangers that quickly created its own challenges because I was in a totally new cultural context. I was somewhere where I didn't know anyone. And I really couldn't read or tell what was hospitality and what was predation. So only a couple of weeks into my time there, this one guy I met kind of fixated on me. He was 20 years older than me. He was married. He worked at a warehouse at the city's port, and he was really nice. He was so nice in a way that felt like too nice. He would call me every day. He brought food over to my apartment. He showed up everywhere I went. And I didn't know what this was. On Kamchatka, I thought, is this okay on Kamchatka? I don't know. In New York, I would block this person's number, I think. So one evening, this guy says, let me drive you around the city so you can see the sights. And I say, sure. He picks me up from my apartment after sunset. We end up parking at the city center at that same gorgeous place I'd gone to my first day. We walk down to the bay, this beautiful bay, and he says, come on. And he walks to the left on the path that goes behind that big hill. So I follow. There's the sheer face of the hill on one side, and there's the water, this flat water on the other. And the path is rocky, and it's getting narrower. And the plaza where all the pedestrians are, it's not visible behind us anymore at all. There's no one else around. And it's dark. And I'm walking behind him, I'm looking at his back, and I think, I'm about to get hurt. So he did not murder me. Lucky again. I did not get hurt. In fact, after a minute, he sat down on those rocks, the nuclear lights were twinkling way across the water, and he said, seen any good movies lately? And I was like, But really, this evening turned out to be absolutely benign. And later, this guy actually became one of my best friends on Kamchatka. This is like months later, he's showing me a walk around the city, a much less picturesque part of the city. All his enthusiasm was really just enthusiasm. He wanted to practice his English. He was super excited to have a new person to show the peninsula to. But I will never forget that walk down that path, because it was this narrow line between safety and horror, and the perception of exactly how vulnerable you are. The person you're with is bigger, stronger, a local, a citizen, which I was not, of course. They're well connected.
Can you turn the lights off?
Yeah.
Turn the lights off so we can see it more vividly?
Yes, you can look at all my Kamchatka gun pictures, which I realized I have quite a few. How's that?
That's good, but
That's
how
good.
about this row right in front here?
How about this one? What do we think? We're going to keep it very like a theater in here. How's our Kamchatka guns? So the person you're with is in control. And if they choose to hurt you, what do, right? What can you do? How under threat do you live? So we've all walked that line. It is the experience of women in a patriarchy, the poor in a society obsessed with wealth, indigenous communities in a colonized country, and those made outsiders in a nationalist state. It is certainly Russian. All these photos I'm showing you are from Russia, from Kamchatka. It is profoundly American, that experience, because it's an international experience of being at risk and of knowing that at any moment things might go wrong. So Disappearing Earth is rooted in such a moment. I'm just going to read you the first couple pages, how the book opens. It's like the first 2 pages. Ooh, things are falling out of my bag. Sophia, sandals off, was standing at the water's edge. The bay snuck up to swallow her toes, gray salt water over bright skin. "Don't go out any farther," Alyona said. The water receded. Alyona could see under her sister's feet the pebbles breaking the curves of Sophia's arches, the sweep of grit left by little waves. Sophia bent to roll up her pant legs, and her ponytail flipped over the top of her head. Her calves showed flaking streaks of blood from scratched mosquito bites. Alyona knew from the firm line of her sister's spine that Sophia was refusing to listen. "You better not," Alyona said. Sophia stood to face the water. It was calm, barely touched by ripples that made the bay look like a sheet of hammered tin. The current got stronger as it pulled into the Pacific, leaving Russia behind for open ocean. But here it was domesticated. It belonged to them. Hands propped on narrow hips, Sophia surveyed it, the width of the bay, the mountains on the horizon, the white lights of the military installation on the opposite shore. The gravel under the sisters was made of chips from bigger stones. Alyona leaned against the block the size of a hiking backpack, and a meter behind her was the crumbling cliff face of St. Nicholas Hill. Water on one side, rock wall on the other. They had walked along the coast this afternoon until they found this patch, free of bottles or feathers, to settle. When seagulls landed nearby, Alyona chased them away with a wave of her arm. The whole summer had been cool, drizzly, but this August afternoon was warm enough to wear short sleeves. Sophia took a step out, and her heel went under. Alyona sat up. "Soph, I said no." Her sister backed up. A gull flew over. "Why do you have to be such a brat?" "I'm not." "You are. You always are." "No," Sophia said, turning around. Her tipped-up eyes, thin lips, sharp jaw, even the point of her nose annoyed Alyona. At 8 years old, Sophia still looked 6. Alyona, 3 years older, was short for her age, but Sophia was tiny all over, from waist to wrists, and sometimes acted like a kindergartner. She kept a row of stuffed animals at the foot of her bed, played pretend that she was a world-famous ballerina, couldn't fall asleep at night if she caught even one scene of a horror movie on the TV. Their mother indulged her. Being born second had given Sophia the privilege of staying a baby all her life. Gaze fixed on a spot on the cliff far above Alyona's head, Sophia lifted one foot out of the water, pointed wet toes, and raised her arms to fifth position. She tipped and caught herself. Alyona shifted her seat on the stones. Their mother always tried to get Alyona to take her sister along to classmates' apartments, but these little misdeeds were exactly why she would not. Instead, they had spent their summer vacations alone with each other. While Sophia balanced, Alyona looked along the shore. A man was picking his way along the rocks. "Someone's coming," Alyona said. Her sister splashed one leg down and lifted the other. Sophia might not care who saw her act like an idiot, but Alyona, her forced companion, did. "Stop," Alyona said, more loudly, heating up in her mouth. "Stop!" Sophia stopped. Now, you all know the story behind this story now, right? You can hear all the ways this has been made into fiction, the fact of what happened. There are so many differences between what actually happened to me and what these characters are experiencing on the page. In real life, I was not Russian or 11 or 8 years old or hanging out during my summer vacation. I wasn't lying in the sun or playing in the water. I don't have a sister. I'm the baby, so I'm the second one. I have an older brother. But what is the same, what is shared between these sisters and my life and all of our lives, I really believe that, is that path. So Alyona and Sophia are going to meet the man who's on the shoreline with them. They're going to follow him, like I followed my friend. In this fictional world, the man has sprained his ankle on those rocks on the path, and the girls help him to his car. In thanks, he offers them a ride home, and they accept. I'm just going to read about one page, an excerpt from the book about that car ride. So this is when they're in the car. From the passenger seat, Alyona took the man's features apart. A wide nose and a mouth underneath that matched. Short brown eyelashes, round chin. His body looked carved out of fresh butter. He was too heavy, probably. That must be why he had stepped clumsily on the shore. "Do you have a girlfriend?" asked Sophia. He laughed and shifted gears, accelerating up a hill. The car hummed underneath them. The bay drew away behind. "No, I don't." "And you're not married?" "Nope." He lifted his hand, fingers spread to show. Sophia said, "I saw already." "Clever thing," he said. "How old are you?" 8. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "And you're also not married, am I right?" Sophia giggled. Alyona turned to watch the road. His car was taller than their mother's sedan. She could look down on roof racks and along the pink lines of drivers' arms. People were sunburned after this one day of good weather. "Can I put the window down?" she asked. "I prefer the air conditioning. Straight through this intersection?" "Yes, please." The trees along the sidewalks were fat and green from this rainy summer. They passed ragged billboards on their left and concrete-paneled apartment buildings on their right. "Here," Alyona said. "Here. Oh." She twisted in her seat. "You missed the turn." "You missed the turn," Sophia said from the back. "I want to take you to my place first," the man said. "I need a little more help." So these sisters are in the moment when things go wrong. Their luck has turned. This is a girl I met who was a little younger than Sophia, who also wanted to be a ballerina. Disappearing Earth is about how these two sisters go missing and what impact that has on the people around them. This chapter ends in that car still. That car keeps driving. And every chapter that follows this first one moves us forward 1 month from that day, 1 month from their disappearance, and focuses on a different character somehow connected to the crime. Over the course of a year on Kamchatka, we come to know the detective on their case, the witness to their abduction, the mother who is waiting for them to come home. We also meet characters who are connected much more distantly, characters who never met the girls at all, maybe, and yet are still impacted by what happened to them, whose lives are changed in some way because what happened to these girls. And every one of these characters, no matter how closely or distantly related, they grapple with their own power or powerlessness, their fear, their fury, their complicity, and their desire to regain control. Where their individual experiences all come together is where we find the clues to solve the sisters' mystery. So I really want to emphasize that. It's so important for me to say that those clues are there. I showed you some of my scarier Kamchatka photos before, but these are ones that always make me happy when I look at them. This novel is about violence and loss, but it's also about finding answers. It's about those paths, those dreadful paths that we walk, but also the connections that might surprise us at the path's end. The risk is enormous. The danger is real. Someone may hurt you, and yet there is hope. Community can save us. We can come together to save ourselves. And I really hope that search for connections resonates with you. I believe that it might, because I think that's why we come to a place like this. We come here to connect with each other. We're seeking community, seeking answers, seeking relief. We're searching together for ways to move forward. We come here to hope. These are my hope pictures. We're on the beach there, jumping. This is, I don't know if you can see this, but this is a very sweet 6-year-old girl. She's in a pink sweater, and she's holding a reindeer antler. She's the daughter of a reindeer herding family in central Kamchatka, and she's very proud and excited to show her antler off. And this is a little girl, and she's smiling. I don't know if anyone can guess why she's smiling. She made a snowman, which we can only imagine what could be inside that snowman. What you're doing here right now, tonight, connecting to each other and to this place and to stories, I hope. It's exactly why I and those other kids were in that Write Your Own Book library program 24 years ago. It's why I went to Kamchatka. It's why this novel exists now. It is chasing that connection. It's trying to connect to a community. It is a dream come true to get to share this book and these pictures with you. I'm so grateful to you. And speaking of seeking answers, I wonder if we can open up our conversation. I wonder if anyone has questions to start a Q&A. Some folks have read it, but it's not in Russian yet. So it's only English is available. And a couple other languages, but no Russian publishing house has bought it yet. My fingers are crossed. Because the people who read it are people who are putting in a lot of effort right now. People who, for example, are really invested in me, are really invested in the story, or were sort of integral in bringing this book to life. And so their response is very warm, because it kind of has to be, because they spent some years helping me create it. I have had some responses from folks. One of my favorite things about this is very subjective, but my experience in Russia is always that I could trust and count on the folks I was talking to be very straightforward with me. Very loving, but very straightforward. And so some of the feedback I've gotten is that mix. People say, like, really enjoyed this, really liked it, proud of you. On page 72, somebody peels a cow tongue and then boils it, and they should boil it and then peel it. And I say, thank you. So hopefully all that feedback will be incorporated into the paperback. There are some details like that I didn't get right despite my best efforts. So I'm very grateful for that feedback and all feedback from Kamchatka. But that's really all the feedback that's coming right now is pretty much in that form.
I was wondering security.
Yeah. I think often the folks. This is a thesis I have that a belief I have that is, like you said, like not particular to Kamchatka. I think often the folks in authority do not save us, or
Especially women.
Yeah.
In the relationship with women. You did
Yeah.
a beautiful job bringing that out.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I haven't heard from anyone in the security forces in Kamchatka, and I heard from them so much while I was there that I hope I will never hear from them. They were very actively interested in what an American was doing. I went there on a Fulbright, so I was funded by the U.S. government, and it's hard to say you're not a spy when you're so clearly a spy. I mean, like, I was not a spy, but people were like, and where's that money coming from? And you're here for how long? I was like, the American government, I'm here for a year. Yeah. Yeah. I think that having the hard copy with the characters in front and also the map of Kamchatka, I think is such a gift to be able to have those resources. And it's something that those qualities those characteristics of the book came later in the sort of editorial process, and were so helpful and such proof of why it's helpful to have fresh eyes on the book, because to me, I'm like, oh, well, all of these people are so easy to tell apart, and I know their entire backstories, and like, I was way too deep in the project to see it clearly. So none of these characters are based on any one person, and all of these characters are based on like a million people. The way that I write fiction is that there's a chapter in the book about a woman that loses her dog, whose dog runs away. And I like to use this as an example because it's the first chapter I wrote in the book, and it is such a it ended up being a sort of template for how I approach the rest of the book, which is that first there's a situation, so a sort of one sentence situation. A woman loses her dog. A woman's dog runs away. And then out of that, I think, well, how would that be most impactful? Maybe the dog, she's very, very attached to the dog. So this loss is heightened if she is so attached to the dog. And maybe she's so attached to the dog because the dog is unconditionally loving to her, and she feels like everyone else has been conditionally loving. So she's quite, in her human relationships, like quite cynical and feels really lonely. But in the dog relationship, she feels seen and she feels known. And then thinking about like, okay, well, what would make her feel most lonely? So what is her job like? What is her personal life like? What are her friendships like? What is her relationship to her parents like? Like all these qualities come out of the situation. And then that person becomes real, and then in my head, and then she seems to be herself. I've realized now that a lot of what I think of as, sometimes people I know will read this and they'll say, I recognize that moment of this character. I recognize this quality of this character. For example, there's a story in that dog chapter where she's recalling, there's a moment in that dog chapter where she was recalling that her ex-husband once threw a stick for a dog over a cliff, and that the dog starts to run after it, and that this is to her very horrifying. And representative of her relationship with the dog, representative of her relationship with her ex, like representative of her relationship in so many things. So my friend, I remember years ago, my friend telling me a story where her dad threw a stick for their family dog off the cliff. And she was so scared as a little girl watching this happen, thinking, oh my God, the dog's gonna run off the cliff, and then it didn't. That person, that friend, is not this character, and that dog is not that dog. Even the dogs are, like, the dad is not the ex in the same way that, like, I'm not those little girls on the beach. Or the same way that little ballerina dancing girl is not Sophia, is not the little sister. But there are like these little pieces from anyone who's ever talked to me, pretty much, and any movie I've ever seen, and any book I've ever read, and anything that's ever I've seen in the world. And then they sort of, I grab them all, and then I use them to reinforce the character I'm making up in my head. And so to me, it all seems made up, because it's all so different from what people said. But then to my friend with the dad and the dog, she was like, is this me? And I said, no, it's not you. Or it's you plus 7,000 other people that told me one thing one time. I really love that, and I love your attention to that, because it's that disclosure of where they've been previously published is a disclosure of my strategizing, which is funny. That is, it speaks less to art and more to commerce, or less to art and more to career in some ways. I really wanted, I had had other projects before this that didn't land. I really wanted to publish a book. I had worked on a manuscript before this that didn't find representation, didn't find publication. So with this project, I wanted to be a lot more strategic about getting my work out there. And from the very start, it was going to be, all of these pieces linked together. It's going to be this 13-chapter book going across the course of a year, every chapter a different month, every chapter a different focus character. That's what it's going to be. And part of that, and I thought And some of the advantage of that is that while I'm working on it, I can send early chapters out as short stories and try to place them. And so then whenever I finish the manuscript and I try to send it to an agent, I can say, I have publications in these places. That actually ended up being totally immaterial to finding an agent in the end. But I'm really glad that I was sending them out so determinedly in the beginning, because it helped me feel like the project was alive. It helped sort of feel like I was in the world even as I was working on this project in privacy. So that was a really joyful thing. You're absolutely right that most of the ones that were, about a third of them were published in some earlier form. And it was all in the beginning of working on the manuscript, because as I had the whole draft and kept tightening and tightening those connections together, those connections that were always intended, but took the whole draft to see how they would fit, I would send pieces out, chunks out as submissions, and people would say like, there seem to be these girls in the back. Like, what's going on here? Like, people keep talking about a disappearance, and they seem to be very frightened, and I'm not sure what's going. Seems like it's part of a larger piece, and I would say, yes, it is part of a larger piece. But it was helpful. It was a helpful practice for me. I would say she's also, like so many, like cobbled together of a million different things. There was a woman who, while I had my grant to go to Kamchatka, had also a grant to be in a different city in Western Russia, and she was working at a tuberculosis hospital. And she would talk about, the experience of working in a hospital that didn't have a lot of money, a state hospital that was very resource thin, and how that kind of resonated and affected patient care. In the I don't know if folks haven't read it, that it's a woman who basically goes to the hospital for a minor medical procedure, and you have to bring your own gown, and she hasn't brought her gown, or not even a gown, like a set of pajamas or a set of sterile clothes, and she doesn't have them for herself, so she goes without. Yes. Oh, okay. Well, no spoilers. Okay. Well, first I have to say I'm extremely impressed at book club. I'm in a few different book groups, and all we do when we get together is eat and gossip and don't talk about the book at all. So I'm like, we should talk about themes. And something I always want to talk about. It's hard for me to separate myself. It's impossible for me to separate myself as the writer from myself as the reader. And so much of my intentions, or the things that I want to discuss about the book, are reflections of the fact that this is, like, at this point, basically like I spent 10 years thinking about it. So I think about it in a different way than other people think about it, and I engage with it in a different way than other people engage with it. To me, the book is, despite all my talk of Kamchatka, my maps and my photographs, primarily not about Russia, but about violence against women, or about harm against women. And the structure of the book is designed to run the range of harm. So some of those harms are really sort of attended to in media and highly sensationalized. Then that is, for example, the girls who are kidnapped in the beginning, in the first chapter. They're given a lot of attention, and their experience is actually extremely rare. Abduction by a stranger is so rare, so statistically unlikely. And all of the other characters are connected to them in an experience of harm, connected to them in many ways, but one of them is that they're also experiencing harm, and many of the harms that they're experiencing are very are unremarked upon, are ones that we tell ourselves that we need to accept as commonplace, like a medical trauma, for example. There's no one to talk to about that, and everyone there is acting like it's just normal. Or a character in an abusive relationship who, to her mind, she thinks this is just the way it is. This is what relationships look like. And the conditions that all of those characters exist in and perpetuate or push back against are the same ones that lead to these rare and spectacular instances of violence. To me, that's what the book is about. To me, that's why the structure is the way that it is, and that's why there are so many characters, and that's why every character's experience is different in the way that they relate to the world, in the way that they are harmed or harm others. To me, it's a book about violence against women. And, um, and so that's always something I want to talk about. But how that looks in a book group, I can't imagine being like, so what do you guys think about violence against women? Like, that's a way that I approach the structure, like from a craft perspective, that I don't know would necessarily be the most promising for. I don't know if there are any there's some book groups here. I don't know what's like most promising for. That means a lot to me. To me, so much of the message of the book is how do we, violence is unpredictable and often unavoidable, and it's not something that we control. It's other people hurt us, and sometimes we even hurt people without reflection or intention. And so, like, living in the inevitability of that, how do we create meaning? How do we connect with each other or find beauty or hope in a world that can often be painful, but is so beautiful and hopeful? I see you back there. No. I feel like shame is such a perfect word to use. I mean, like, thank you so much for sharing that. I feel I'm so glad that and grateful that you share that. I feel like it's so important to talk about and so rarely talked about, and plays out, and so those feelings come up like over and over and over again, not just in the moment, but afterwards in every small moment, reckoning with. And a lot of what went into this book was some work I did, first volunteering and then work with a victim services program that provides services to survivors of violence. And in that capacity, my role for a long time was being on call for survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence who would come to emergency rooms. And the training of this is really fantastic. I couldn't recommend it highly enough to be an advocate for others and to meet people who are experiencing the hardest moments in their lives, and to hope too that like someone will be there for the hardest moments in our lives. But part of this training was talking about self-blame, and they were talking about there's so many different coping mechanisms that people have. Of course, like I don't need to say this to anyone. We all know it ourselves. We know from our own experiences. We all process terror and danger and risk in different ways. And self-blame is a really common and really emotionally logical way to react, because folks who, for example, come to the hospital and say, if only I hadn't stayed at the bar after my friends left. If I hadn't stayed at the bar after my friends left, this never would have happened. If I had actually just left with my friends, or even if I had stayed home and done my homework that night instead, or if I hadn't been wearing that, or if I hadn't called a Lyft, if I had just gotten a taxi instead, then none of this would have ever happened. And it's a really useful way to cope, because then you think, so if in the future I don't stay at the bar after my friends leave, then this won't ever happen to me again. Then I'll be okay. And I can actually, if this is my fault, then I can ensure it'll never happen again. And that's so comforting, because the alternative is, if this is not my fault, if this is just something that happens randomly for no reason, no matter what I do, wherever I go, someone could just decide to hurt me and then hurt me, that's horrible to reckon with. It's a whole new way of living and thinking. And I think we see that all the time when we talk, like in our culture, for example, about victims of violence or survivors of violence. We talk about like, they shouldn't do that, they shouldn't do this, because what we're saying is, I won't do that and I won't do this, and then I'll be safe. I'll keep myself safe. And I think shame is so common, and I hope I talk about it in this book, because I think it comes up for all of us all the time. Shame, blame, guilt, questioning. Did you all watch that new, I don't know if any, but this new Netflix series that's come out that's based on a This American Life and ProPublica investigation? What's the series called? Disbelieving? Unbelieving? Unbelievable. Unbelievable. Like really sitting in how what trauma looks like, what shock looks like, how different it looks for every person, and then how narrowly defined shock and trust and victimhood are by those in authority. That they're like, if you're not acting a certain way, if you're not doing a certain thing, if you aren't not given trust or benefit of a doubt or investigation, you're not given those things. I'm really glad you're talking about this, and I hope my book talks about this. This is what I wrote the book to talk about. I'm grateful to you. I can tell you, and we can like talk more privately about how I see it, if that's helpful. By the way, I think everyone, like, I've learned that it's not possible for me to say like, well, the right way to read it is, because there's no, however you read it is the way that you read it. I did not know that the end of the novel was ambiguous until after I got an agent. The week I got my agent, I was in her office and someone walked by and they said, oh, we're having an argument about the ending. No, not intentional at all. Not intentional. From my perspective, I can tell you a lot of things that people think. It was like, people have a lot of different interpretations of the end, every one of which, it's like, every time I hear a new one, I'm like, oh my God, like I had no, because to me it is very, it means a lot to me that you say that, because I think that's what I love to read fiction for, is sitting in the complexity of the ways that we are. That's what I love to read for. I think everything does that, like art does that in general. I hope that's what the book is. I see the time. I think we maybe have time for one more question. Oh gosh. How about I see you? It's about 10% of Kamchatka, so not not a majority at all, but not indigenous peoples of Kamchatka are also like relatively substantial portion of the peninsula. I interrupted you. Keep on going. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's such an important. When I was writing this book, I had and I have really dual impulses. One is to portray Kamchatka as well as I'm able, as accurately as I'm able to the extent that you're ever like, it's so subjective the way you perceive a place, but I really wanted to try to show Kamchatka as it is to the best of my ability in its diversity, in its tension, in its history, in its cultural mix. So often when we are presented with notions of what Russian people look like, or the demographics of Russia, we see a very sort of, who's that guy in Rocky that, like, the kind of like blonde, I think it's Dolph Lundgren, I think he's German actually, but that sort of look of a Russian. That what we're presented with is an ethnic Russian. And Russia is an enormous country with extraordinary diversity. It's also a country in which an ethnic group of Slavs moved by colonization across a territory and colonized Kamchatka relatively late. And Kamchatka has a lot of indigenous Kamchatkans, a lot of indigenous Siberians, and folks who are in power and who have resources are substantially the descendants of colonizers. And so there's an enormous ethnic and racial divide, and also a divide of wealth and class. I wanted to try to reflect that, and I also wanted, the other impulse I had was to always like try to process my own experience in the world, and that experience is so American. And the way I perceive these racial and ethnic dynamics is extremely American. The way I perceive how crime is treated, for example, or how hurt or harm or violence is treated, it is so informed by our identities, by our gender, like that someone believes or disbelieves us because of our gender, because of our sexuality, or our ethnicity, or our class, or where we're coming from, whether we're urban or rural. The ways that we interact with each other, the ways that we see ourselves and that other people see us is so much about our identity and how we're sort of labeled or perceived in the world. And it seems to me to be impossible to write a story of like an incident, for example, I mean that to say a crime, without talking about race and class and gender and like that what we perceive as crime, who we label criminal, who we label victims, who we say you're not a victim, you're not allowed to be a victim, that is so racialized and gendered, and that is so informed by identity. And so to try to write a book of Kamchatka or to try to write a book of America like has to have everything of that as much as possible. It has to be about that, in my opinion. I'll still be here. So if anyone, I don't want to keep anyone away from this Perrier and wine for too long, but I'll be here. Thank you so much. Oh, the title is also one I thought was not, and the title, this is also all a reflection of like how deep I am in the project. The title is about the tsunami story that one sister tells the other in the first chapter. So between the two parts that I read, one sister tells the other a little bit of an urban legend about a wave that hits Kamchatka and washes a town away. The book is like literally, the title of the book is literally a reference to that, to this chunk of disappearing Earth, because just a couple pages later, those girls also find themselves swept away by something out of their control, something they didn't anticipate. So I wanted to speak to that literally. I also wanted to speak to, in general, to a feeling of instability, or, you know, these are people who are living in a peninsula where the nation that they knew was lost effectively overnight. Their economy completely changed. The actual terrain, the ground itself, is unsteady and unpredictable, and you don't know what you're going to lose next. And so I wanted the title to speak to that. I also hoped to find a better title while I was working on it, and I never did. So it stayed. Thank you all so much. Thank you.